Would you tear the silver from your own back just to feel a single heartbeat? I want you to really sit with that question. Not as a hypothetical, not as a poetic flourish designed to pull you in. I mean it literally, in the most visceral, irreversible sense possible. Would you give up everything you are, everything you were built to be, for one moment of something real? Because I did, and I need you to understand what that cost. Not in the abstract, not in the clean, cinematic way that stories usually tell it. Hero sacrifices something, hero gets the thing, roll credits. I mean the actual weight of it, the specific, unglamorous, terrifying reality of choosing mortality when you were made for eternity. For eons, I reigned in the cold perfection of the heavens. I watched civilizations rise like candles, bright, brief, beautiful, and collapse back into the dark. I watched lovers find each other across impossible distances. I watched children take their first steps on unsteady legs, arms out for balance, faces lit with the shock of their own capability. I watched the dying reach for hands that couldn't follow them into whatever came next. I watched all of it, every birth, every ending, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon that someone would remember for the rest of their life as the moment everything changed. And I felt nothing. Let me tell you what forever actually feels like. It doesn't feel like peace. It doesn't feel like power. It doesn't feel like the grand hymnal light-drenched thing they tell you it is. It feels like standing behind glass, watching everything that matters happen on the other side of a window you can never open. Everything is visible, nothing is reachable, and after long enough, you stop reaching. That's the part they don't tell you about eternity. Not that it's painful, that it makes you stop trying. In the beginning, the heavens were enough. I remember the first 1,000 years the way you might remember a dream. Hazy, luminous, too beautiful to fully grasp. The celestial light didn't just illuminate the world, it was the world. Silver and absolute, pure and unchanging. There was a kind of majesty to it that I won't pretend wasn't real. It was real. It was extraordinary. And for a long time, I thought extraordinary was the same as meaningful. It isn't. Nothing changes in eternity. That is its greatest gift and its most devastating curse. The light I bathed in 1,000,000 years ago is the same light I wake to today, the same hymns echoing through the same vast silence, the same cold perfections stretching out in every direction like a mirror reflecting nothing but itself. Think about what that does to a mind, to a soul. Humans talk about comfort in routine, and I understand that. There is something stabilizing about the familiar, the predictable, the reliable rhythms of a life. But there's a difference between routine and stasis. Routine means the same coffee every morning in a world that is still, beneath the surface, constantly shifting. Stasis means nothing shifts. Not the light, not the temperature, not the ache in your chest, because you don't have an ache. You can't. Aching requires wanting, and wanting requires believing that something could be different. After enough centuries, I stopped believing anything could be different. Do you know what it is to watch 10,000 sunsets and feel not one of them? Mortals chase the sunset. They ache for it. They pull their loved ones close and say, "Look, look at that," as if the sky might forget to do it again tomorrow. They photograph it, not because the photograph will ever capture it, but because the act of trying to hold it is its own kind of love. They sit in lawn chairs with wine and they don't say anything, and the silence between them is full of something that doesn't need words. I watched that millions of times from the appropriate celestial distance. And maybe I was wrong, but I always thought the beauty of a sunset was inseparable from the fear that it might not come back, that the gasp in a human chest when the light hits the horizon just right, that isn't pure aesthetic appreciation. That's mortality recognizing itself in the fading light. That's a body that will one day stop saying, look at that, understanding, somewhere below language, that this particular combination of sky and moment and person beside you will never happen again in exactly this way. I had no such fear, and without fear, there is no wonder. Without wonder, there is no hunger. Without hunger, there is no love. Without love, what exactly are we calling divinity? I began to drift toward the edges of the heavens, closer to the world below, closer to the noise and the mess and the magnificent, infuriating chaos of mortal life. I would hover at the threshold, where the celestial gives way to the earthly, where the clean silver silence of eternity blurs into the warm, complicated frequency of human experience. And I would listen. I would listen to arguments between strangers that somehow, inexplicably, ended in laughter. I would listen to mothers singing off-key to children who didn't care about the pitch, only the presence. I would listen to old men sitting in silence beside old women who had been sitting in silence beside them for 50 years, needing nothing more than proximity to feel that the whole thing had been worth it. I would listen to someone crying in a car, in a parking lot, alone, before going back inside to face whatever they were crying about. The particular bravery of that, of feeling the thing fully in private so you could function in public, I found that more moving than anything I had ever witnessed from altitude. I was jealous. An eternal being, jealous of the dying. I didn't have language for it then, but something in me was beginning to understand that all the things I had believed made mortality tragic, the fragility, the brevity, the vulnerability, the absolute certainty of loss, were not the flaws in the design. They were the design. The grief is what makes the love matter. The ending is what makes the moment irreplaceable. The wound is what proves the thing was real enough to hurt. An existence without any of that isn't elevated. It's hollow. It's a life-shaped absence of life. I stood at the threshold and looked down at the living world, and I felt something I had no celestial category for. I wanted in. Then I saw her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't thunder and revelation and celestial light rearranging itself to point at her. It was an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary city, the kind of afternoon that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening. She was sitting on the steps of a building, reading a book she'd clearly read before. You could tell by the way she smiled at certain pages, the smile of someone greeting an old friend, someone who already knows what's coming and is glad to arrive there again. She had a cup of tea that had gone cold. She didn't notice, or didn't mind. Either way, she didn't reach for it again. There was a cut on her left hand, small, already healing, the kind of cut you get from something mundane and slightly embarrassing, opening a package or reaching past something sharper than you expected. She absently pressed her thumb against it the way people do when pain has become familiar, manageable, hers. I had watched millions of humans live and die and never once felt the urge to descend. But her, I couldn't look away. It wasn't her beauty, though she was beautiful in the specific way that people are beautiful when they're entirely themselves and entirely unaware of it. When no part of them is performing or presenting or managing how they're being perceived. She was just there, on those steps, in that afternoon, with her cold tea and her old book and her small, healing wound. And she was there so completely that it felt almost radical. We live in a world that is constantly pulling attention forward, toward the next thing, the better thing, the thing that will finally make this thing worthwhile. And here she was, making this worthwhile. Not because it was extraordinary, because she was paying attention to it. She had mastered the art of being here. I had spent eternity everywhere, and I had never once been here. I went back the next day, and the next. Not with any plan, I want to be honest about that. There was no strategy, no intention beyond the pull of it, the simple and unignorable gravity of someone who makes the world seem worth inhabiting. I watched her move through her life with a kind of grace that had nothing to do with ease. Her life wasn't easy, you could see that clearly. There were hard mornings where she sat at her kitchen table for too long before standing. There were phone calls she stepped away from with her jaw tight and her shoulders drawn in, the body's instinct to make itself smaller against something painful. There were nights she sat in the dark for longer than sleep requires, not doing anything, just sitting, processing, enduring, metabolizing whatever the day had cost her. But she felt all of it. She didn't manage it from a distance, she didn't rise above it or transcend it or maintain a dignified remove from the mess of her own experience. Every single drop of it moved through her, the joy and the grief and the frustration and the mundane irritation of a life that doesn't always cooperate, and she let it. She was permeable in the best possible way, open to being affected. And somehow, in the feeling, in the full, unguarded, unsheltered willingness to be moved, she was more alive than anything I had ever witnessed from the cold silver distance of the heavens. I began to understand what I had been missing. Not peace, not purpose, not even meaning in the grand celestial sense. Something smaller and more devastating than any of that. The experience of being inside a life rather than above it, of not watching the sunset from safe altitude, but standing in the cooling air with someone, shoulders almost touching, and feeling the specific weight of this moment and no other. The terrifying, irreplaceable, once and never again beauty of being mortal. And I knew, standing at the threshold between the divine and the earthly, watching her turn the page of her familiar book in the late afternoon light, I knew I was going to choose her. Not her specifically, not yet. I didn't know her yet. But I was going to choose what she represented. I was going to choose the world she lived in, the fragile, finite, feeling world over the cold perfection of everything I had always been. I just had to understand the cost first. You need to understand what it means for an angel to choose the earth. We don't simply walk down. There is no gentle transition, no graceful migration from the divine to the human, no celestial paperwork that gets stamped and processed and results in a body. To become mortal is to be unmade. It is to surrender every protection, every certainty, every guarantee that has defined your existence since before time had a name for itself. It is, in the truest sense, a death. Not the death that mortals fear, the cessation, the ending, the going dark. Something in some ways more terrifying, the death of what you were in order to become something entirely new, something smaller, something softer, something that can be hurt. The wings go first. I used to think the wings were a gift. The lift of them, the freedom, the clean, cold rush of altitude with nothing beneath you and everything above, and the world spread out below like something that belongs to you by virtue of your height. There is a vanity in wings that I didn't recognize as vanity until I chose to give them up. Standing at the threshold, preparing myself for what I was about to do, I finally understood what they actually were. They were distance. They were the physical expression of my separation from everything below. They were proof, worn on my back, that I was above it all, above the mess, above the pain, above the beautiful catastrophe of mortal life. They were the architectural feature of a being designed never to land, and landing was all I wanted. We stripped the silver from our back, trading the weight of eternity for the warmth of a pulse. I want you to sit with that image. Silver, not gold. I've thought about this, and it matters. Gold is loud.
Gold is triumph and announcement and the brash confidence of something that knows its own worth. Silver is different. Silver is colder, more elegant, more solitary. The silver of moonlight on empty water. The silver of a mirror that only ever shows you yourself. The silver of something precious that has, for all its beauty, never once been warm. That was the heavens. That was divinity, silver and cold and perfect and untouchable, and beneath all the grandeur, unspeakably alone. I stripped it away, and in its place, a heartbeat. Do you have any idea what that feels like when you've never had one? When your existence has been defined by stillness, by the absence of biological urgency, by a body that requires nothing and therefore wants nothing? A heartbeat is not just rhythm, it is not just biology, it is the body's most fundamental statement of existence. I am here, I am here, I am here, 60 times a minute, relentless, faithful, utterly indifferent to whether you're ready for it. It doesn't ask your permission, it doesn't pause for you to compose yourself, it simply insists over and over on the fact of you. I stood on the pavement, actual pavement, cold and uneven and faintly dirty, nothing like the smooth silver floors of the heavens, and I felt my first heartbeat, and my second, and my third, and somewhere around the fourth or fifth I understood that this was now the rhythm of everything, that my life would now be measured in these small, mortal insistences, that I would live and think and feel and eventually end in the spaces between them. And I wept.
Not from grief, from recognition, from the sudden, overwhelming sense of finally having arrived somewhere I had been trying to reach for longer than I had words to describe. This is what it is to be alive. Not the duration, not the grandeur, not the sweep and the scale and the cosmic significance of an eternal existence, just this, the pulse, the pavement, the weight of a body that can hurt and hunger and want things it cannot guarantee it will receive. We cast aside celestial grace to bleed beside her, choosing a single fragile heartbeat over 1,000 years of cold perfection. People always ask, was it worth it? They ask it with the kind of pity, usually, the assumption tucked inside the question that I must, at some level, regret it, that the math doesn't work out. Eternity on one side of the scale, one mortal life on the other. How could one life outweigh forever? But that question only makes sense if you believe that length is the same as value, that more time means more meaning, that a life measured in millennia is richer than one measured in decades. I lived in eternity. I know what eternity is worth. It is worth exactly as much as what fills it, and an eternity of cold silver perfection, of watching the world from behind glass, of feeling nothing, because there is nothing in you capable of being touched, that is not a life of infinite value. That is a very long life of none. Let me ask you something instead. Have you ever felt a hand find yours in the dark? Not because you asked, not because they knew you needed it, but simply because they reached and you were there. Have you ever been so seen by another person that you forgot, for a moment, to be afraid of anything? Have you ever loved someone so completely that the possibility of losing them felt more real than any eternity you'd ever known? Then you already know the answer. I found her the way mortals find each other, by accident, by proximity, by the strange and beautiful gravity that pulls people together when the time is right, and neither of them is paying attention to the fact that something is beginning. A coffee shop, rain against the window, the specific gray-gold light of a rainy afternoon that makes interiors feel more interior, more sealed off from the world, more like a room that exists outside of ordinary time. She came in shaking water from her jacket, slightly out of breath, more amused than annoyed by the weather. She looked around at the crowded room, did the quick mental math that strangers do in shared spaces, and walked toward my table. She asked if she could sit. I said yes. She sat down. And that was it. That was the whole architecture of it. 2 people and a table and rain on the glass. She smelled like rain and old paper and something warm I didn't have a name for yet. Something that made the new heartbeat in my chest do something irregular that I didn't yet have enough mortal experience to identify as wanting.
She talked first. I would learn that she always talked first. Not from nervousness, but from genuine, unguarded curiosity. She was interested in things, in people, in the specific texture of a stranger's story. She asked questions the way some people collect objects, carefully, with intention, because she planned to keep them and return to them later. She asked me where I was from. I said, somewhere far, somewhere cold, somewhere I'm not anymore. And she looked at me with those eyes, the eyes of someone who has said a version of that sentence herself, who knows exactly the particular geography of a place you've left behind and can never entirely return to, and she nodded, not with pity, with recognition. She understood leaving. We talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, the kind of conversation that has no agenda and no destination, that isn't trying to get anywhere, that is content to simply be where it is. We talked about books she'd loved and why, about cities she'd been to alone and what that felt like, about the strange phenomenon of feeling more yourself in unfamiliar places than in familiar ones, about how sometimes the most honest version of a person only comes out when no one who knows them is watching. I had been watching humans for longer than history. I had observed more conversations than there are words in any language, and I had never been in one. Not like this. Not where I was genuinely uncertain what would be said next, where I was leaning in, where the other person's thoughts felt like territory I wanted to explore. She was curious about me in a way that should have been difficult. I was, after all, carrying an entire existence she had no framework for. But she asked her questions and accepted my answers, and filed them away with the same gentle, non-judgmental attention she seemed to give to everything, as if the unusual wasn't something to be suspicious of, just something to be understood. At some point, the rain stopped, and neither of us mentioned leaving. At some point, her hands were on the table and mine were near them, and the distance between them felt like the most significant geography I had ever crossed, more significant than the distance from the heavens to the earth, because that distance I had chosen deliberately, with intention, with the full force of a cosmic decision. This distance, 3 inches of wooden table between 2 sets of hands, that was different. That was terrifying in an entirely new way. That was hope, and hope is something entirely new when you've never had anything to lose. And then she said something small, I won't tell you what, a small observational joke about the way the last of the afternoon light was hitting the coffee cups, and I laughed. A real laugh, a mortal laugh, chest and breath, and the involuntary, unstoppable expression of something that delights you. I had heard a million human laughs from altitude. I had never had one. She looked at me when I laughed, the way people look at someone they're deciding about, and whatever she saw, it must have been enough, because she smiled, the full version, not the polite one, and looked back at her cup. And I understood, in that moment, everything. Why the sunset is worth chasing, why the ache is worth having, why a creature built for eternity would strip the silver from his back and choose the pavement and the heartbeat and the terrifying, glorious uncertainty of a mortal life. I had given up eternity. I had surrendered my wings. I had chosen the heartbeat over the heavens. And sitting there, in the warm light of that small coffee shop, rain-wet and mortal and more afraid than I had ever been and more alive than I had ever been, those 2 things, inseparable because that is what mortality is, I felt it. Not love the way angels speak of it in the abstract, from safe altitude as a concept to be observed and cataloged. Not love as a cosmic principle or a divine attribute or a theological position. Love as weight. Love as warmth. Love as the specific, particular, unrepeatable gravity of one person, this afternoon, this table, this rain light, who makes the whole mortal mess of it feel not like a tragedy, but like exactly what it was always supposed to be. Divinity is a hollow prize when her mortal touch is the only salvation. I want you to hear that, not as poetry, not as metaphor, not as the kind of beautiful sounding sentence you half listen to and half forget, as a confession. Because I genuinely believe this. We all have a version of this choice. Not wings. Most of you weren't born with wings and aren't in danger of trading them for anything. But we all have our own version of the heavens, our own cold perfection, our own silver distance that we maintain between ourselves and the things that could really move us. We build it slowly, and we call it by different names at different stages of our lives. We call it being realistic. We call it protecting ourselves. We call it not being the kind of person who gets swept up in things, who lets their emotions make their decisions, who falls too fast or cares too much or shows their hand before they know the other person's. We call it composure. We call it maturity. We call it wisdom. But I lived in the genuine article, actual eternity, actual divine remove, actual immunity from loss. And I am telling you from experience, it isn't wisdom, it's just a different kind of loneliness dressed up in more impressive clothes. Safe is a glass wall, and you can spend an eternity behind it, watching the sunsets, watching the lovers, watching the beautiful, ordinary chaos of a life fully lived by someone braver than you, and never once feel the rain. Never once have the specific, irreplaceable experience of being in it, of being wet and cold and slightly inconvenienced and entirely, completely, breathtakingly here. The rain doesn't care about your composure. The heartbeat doesn't ask your permission. The love, the real kind, the kind that changes you, it doesn't arrive when you're ready for it. It arrives when it arrives. And you can let it in, or you can watch it from altitude until it passes. I chose the rain. I chose the heartbeat. I chose the cold tea and the familiar book, and the small healing wound, and the 3-inch distance across a coffee shop table that felt like the most important distance in the universe. I chose to be unmade and remade as something smaller, softer, more fragile, more temporary, and more real than I had ever been in 1,000 years of silver, cold, perfect, hollow divinity. And if eternity is the price,
I would pay it again. I would pay it in a heartbeat.
we strip the silver from our back, trading the weight of eternity for the warmth of a pulse. We cast aside celestial grace to bleed beside her, choosing a single fragile heartbeat over 1,000 years of cold perfection. Divinity is a hollow prize when her mortal touch is the only salvation.